My name's Sam. I'm 32, work in IT, and spend most of my days buried in lines of code and troubleshooting issues for people who barely know how to restart their computers. It's not the most thrilling job, but it pays well and keeps me busy. The truth is, I've always been more comfortable behind a screen than out in the world. My friend Jake and I were close in university, but life pulled us apart. He was always the adventurous one, and when he suggested this trip, I saw it as a chance to reconnect. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Just me, my best friend Jake, and the wilderness. No phones, no distractions, just the two of us reconnecting after years of drifting apart. We'd chosen a remote campsite deep in the Pine Ridge National Forest, a place so far off the grid that even the park rangers rarely patrolled it. The kind of place where you could scream at the top of your lungs and no one would hear you. Looking back, maybe that should have been the first red flag. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. We hiked through dense woods, the kind where the sunlight barely touches the ground. We set up camp near a small, crystal-clear lake, the kind of spot you see in nature documentaries. Jake was in high spirits, cracking jokes and reminiscing about the old days. But as the sun dipped below the trees, something shifted. It started with the fire. We'd built it together, stacking dry wood and kindling until the flames roared to life. But as night fell, the fire began to behave. Strangely, it would flicker and dance, then suddenly die down to embers, only to flare up again moments later. Jake laughed it off, blaming it on the wind, but there was no wind. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. Then came the noises. At first, it was just the usual sounds of the forest: crickets, the occasional owl, the rustle of leaves. But then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone beating a drum in the distance. Jake heard it too. His face went pale, and for the first time since we'd arrived, he looked genuinely uneasy. "Probably just some animal," he said, but his voice wavered. The thumping grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to surround us, echoing through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then the fire went out. Not like it had been doing earlier, flickering and sputtering. This time, it was as if someone had thrown a bucket of water on it. 1 second it was burning bright. The next it was gone, leaving us in complete darkness. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." He didn't respond. I turned the flashlight toward him, and my blood ran cold. He was gone. "Jake," I shouted, panicking now. "This isn't funny, man. Where are you?" No answer. Just that damn thumping, louder than ever. I stumbled through the woods, calling his name, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off trees and underbrush. My mind raced with possibilities. Had he wandered off? Was he hurt? Or was something else going on? Something I couldn't explain. Then I saw it. A figure, standing motionless between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I raised the flashlight, illuminating the scene. It was Jake. But he wasn't alone. There was someone else with him. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. Jake stood beside him, his expression blank, his body rigid. "Jake," I screamed, my voice breaking. "What the hell is going on?" The man tilted his head, as if studying me. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could react, Jake moved. But it wasn't Jake. Not really. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. He lunged at me, his hands clawing at my throat. I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as we struggled. "Jake, stop!" I choked out, but he didn't. His grip tightened, his eyes empty, devoid of any recognition. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Jake released me and stepped back, his body going limp. The man was gone, vanished into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, my mind reeling. Jake stared at me, his expression a mix of confusion and horror. What just happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to leave. Now. We packed up camp in record time, not bothering to put out the fire that had mysteriously reignited. The thumping had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As we hiked back to the car, Jake was quiet, his usual bravado gone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following us. But the woods were empty, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We made it to the car just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. I've never been so relieved to see pavement in my life, but the story doesn't end there. A week later, I got a call from Jake's wife. He'd been acting strange since our trip, she said. Distant, paranoid, like he wasn't himself. Then, one night, he disappeared. The police found his car parked at the edge of Pine Ridge National Forest. They searched the area but found no trace of him. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. I never went back to those woods, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that thumping sound again, and I can't help but wonder if Jake is still out there, waiting for me to come find him, or if something else is. A few weeks after Jake's disappearance, I was cleaning out my garage when I stumbled across an old box of his things. He'd left it at my place before the trip, and I'd forgotten about it. Inside, I found a stack of newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. My stomach dropped as I read the headlines. Serial killer strikes again in Pine Ridge National Forest. The articles detailed a string of murders that had taken place decades ago. The killer would lure victims into the woods, never to be seen again. He was described as tall and gaunt, with a gravelly voice. The descriptions matched the man I'd seen that night. But the real shock came when I found Jake's notebook buried beneath the clippings. It was filled with notes about the killer, his methods, his victims, even the exact location of his hidden campsite. Jake had been obsessed with finding it. I felt sick. Had Jake known what we were walking into? Had he planned it all along? Then I found the final entry in his notebook, dated the night before our trip. It read, "I'm close. I can feel it. Tomorrow, I'll finally meet him." I don't know what happened to Jake that night. Maybe he was a victim, lured into the killer's trap. Or maybe he was something else entirely. All I know is that I hear the thumping sometimes, late at night. I don't know what happened to Jake. Police did nothing to find him, and I have no guts to go into that dense forest. I just pray that if Jake is there, I hope he is alive and doing well. I grew up in Chicago, surrounded by concrete and neon lights. My childhood was filled with the sound of car horns, not rustling leaves. But my grandfather, a former park ranger in the Pacific Northwest, always spoke of the woods as if they were alive, both beautiful and dangerous. He would tell me, nature isn't just trees and rivers. It watches. It remembers. As a kid, I shrugged it off as one of his many strange sayings. He was a man of the wild after all, and I was a city boy through and through. Years later, after he passed, I found his old journal tucked away in a box of his belongings. It was filled with stories of his time patrolling remote areas, mostly in the Olympic National Park in Washington. Most entries were harmless, run-ins with lost hikers, accounts of stunning sunrises over the Hoh rainforest, or the occasional bear sighting. But one entry stood out. It was dated October 1987 and simply read, "He's still here, and he knows I see him." I never understood what he meant, not until last year. I had taken a break from work, burnout, stress, the usual city life pressure. I wanted silence. So, I picked a remote national park and set off alone. I chose the Olympic National Park, partly because of my grandfather's stories, and partly because I wanted to feel close to him. I packed my gear, drove to the trailhead near the Quinault rainforest, and hiked 5 miles into the forest. I found the perfect spot by a secluded lake, far from any trails. It was peaceful. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice reminding me to respect the woods. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of water lapping against the shore. But the second night, something changed. I woke up cold, despite my sleeping bag. The fire had burned out, but something else felt wrong, off. Then I noticed it, my boots. I had placed them neatly by the tent entrance before sleeping, but now they were turned around, facing away from the tent. A small thing, sure. Maybe I knocked them over in my sleep, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Morning came, and I decided to brush it off. I spent the day exploring, taking in the scenery, letting my mind relax. But that feeling, that wrongness, never left me. I should have packed up then, but I didn't. By dusk, I was back at camp, exhausted. I forced myself to shake the unease and started a fire. As the flames crackled, I heard something. A laugh, not an animal, not the wind. A low, breathy chuckle, somewhere between the trees. I froze, my body stiff. I called out, "Hello?" Silence. I stood, grabbing my flashlight, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was the wind through the branches, playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle, every snap of a twig had me gripping my knife. Then, at 3 a.m., I heard it again. A laugh, closer this time, right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, the zipper on my tent started to slide down. I lunged forward, throwing my weight against the door, shoving whoever, or whatever, was outside. I scrambled out, flashlight shaking in my grip, scanning the woods. Nothing. But my boots, again, had been moved. This time they were side by side, pointing directly into the forest. I ran. I left my gear, my tent, everything. I sprinted the 5 miles back to my car, barely able to think. The moment I locked the doors and turned on the engine, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You were right to run. I never told anyone where I was going. I never spoke to a soul on that trip. And I sure as hell didn't have phone service in the middle of nowhere." That was the last time I ever went camping alone. A few weeks later, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was my grandfather's old park ranger badge and a note written in his handwriting. "I tried to warn you. He's not just in the woods. He's everywhere." Confused and terrified, I dug deeper into my grandfather's journal. I found a folded map of the Olympic National Park tucked in the back. On it, he had circled a specific area near the lake where I had camped. Scribbled in the margin were the words, "The Watcher, 1987. He's not human." I reached out to a retired ranger who had worked with my grandfather. When I mentioned the Watcher, his face went pale. He told me that in the late 1980s, several rangers reported strange occurrences in the park, missing hikers, unexplained laughter, and footprints that didn't match any known animal. My grandfather had been the only one who claimed to have seen the Watcher. He described it as a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, always just out of reach. But here's the twist. the ranger told me my grandfather had gone missing in 1987. He was presumed dead after a search party found his abandoned gear near the lake. The journal I found. It was mailed to my family a year later with no explanation. I moved back to the city, but my chest always felt heavy and tight. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the laugh. This time, it was inside my apartment. I grabbed my phone and called the police. When they arrived, they found nothing. But on my kitchen counter, they found a single boot print, muddy and fresh, pointing toward the door. And on my phone, another text from the unknown number. You can't escape the watcher. Now, I keep my grandfather's journal close, hoping it holds the key to understanding what's after me. I've always loved camping. There's something about being surrounded by nature, cut off from the constant hum of civilization, that makes me feel at peace. Or at least, it used to. This trip changed everything. My best friend Ryan and I planned a weekend getaway in the woods, just the two of us, some beers, a campfire, and nothing but silence. We picked a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any designated campsites. No signal, no distractions, just pure wilderness. The first night was perfect. We set up our tent, cooked some food over the fire, and talked about everything and nothing. As the night deepened, we lay in our sleeping bags, staring up at the stars through the open tent flap. The world was quiet, peaceful. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. Not a deer, not some small animal. These were deliberate, heavy steps. Someone was walking around our campsite. I sat up, heart hammering, and listened. Ryan was still snoring beside me. I didn't want to wake him in case I was just imagining things. I peeked through the tent's mesh window, but the darkness was so thick I couldn't see much. The sound stopped. I convinced myself it was nothing and somehow managed to fall asleep again. The next morning I found footprints, human ones. They circled our campsite, stopping just outside our tent. Ryan laughed it off, saying maybe some hiker had passed through. But hikers don't walk in circles around a tent in the middle of the night. I shrugged it off. We spent the day fishing at a nearby stream, enjoying the quiet. By the time we got back, the footprints had faded, and I started to feel silly for being so paranoid. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the trees made my skin prickle. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no noises. Just the steady rhythm of Ryan breathing beside me. The third day, we decided to pack up and head home early. As we were loading our gear into our backpacks, Ryan stopped. His face paled. "What?" I asked. He didn't speak. He just pointed at the tree next to our tent. Carved into the bark, deep and jagged, were 3 words: leave, now, run. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some hiker passing through. Someone had been here, watching us, close enough to carve those words while we slept. We didn't even argue about it. We packed everything at record speed and got the hell out of there. Halfway through our hike back, we reached a fork in the trail. That's when we saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the path. He was dressed in a tattered flannel shirt, jeans and hiking boots caked in mud. He wasn't moving, just staring. "Morning," Ryan said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond, didn't even blink. Something about him felt wrong, not in a supernatural way, but in a very human, very real way. Ryan grabbed my wrist. "Let's take the other trail." We veered left, keeping our pace steady but brisk. I could feel my pulse in my throat. When we finally glanced back, the man was gone. We walked in silence, both of us too uneasy to talk. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our boots. Then, after about 10 minutes, I realized something. "This isn't the right trail," I whispered. Ryan stopped. We looked around. The trees here were denser. The path was thinner, more overgrown. My stomach twisted. "We must have—" Ryan's voice caught in his throat. Ahead of us, nailed to a tree, was a photograph. A photo of us, sitting by our campfire. It wasn't from this trip. The angle was different. The fire was smaller, but there was no mistaking it. It was us. My mind raced. This meant, we need to move. Now. I grabbed Ryan's arm. We turned and bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, lungs burning, feet pounding the dirt. I didn't care if we were loud. I didn't care if I tripped. I just wanted to get out. We ran until the trees thinned out, until we saw the road where we had parked. The car was still there. Everything was untouched. We threw our bags in the back and peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind us. We didn't talk on the drive home. It's been 6 months since that trip. I haven't been camping since. Haven't even been near a forest. Because here's the thing that keeps me up at night. That photo, the one nailed to the tree. I went through my phone later. The timestamp on it was from a year ago. But I don't remember that trip. I don't remember ever being in those woods before.